I told my stepmom that her and my dad's expectations were unfair to us. Look, I'm 17 years old, and my twin sister Robin is also 17. Our mother died when we were 6. Our father started dating another woman when we were 7, and we met our stepmother when we were 8. When my father and stepmother were talking about moving in together and getting married, they asked Robin and me what we thought and what we were worried about. We both said we didn't want things to change too much, that we liked going to our grandparents' house after school until Dad picked us up from work, and that we didn't want that to stop, that we didn't want it to mean having a new mom. We were worried that Dad would stop talking about Mom and that we would also have to stop talking about her. They told us we didn't have to see our stepmother as our new mom and that we didn't have to stop going to our grandparents' house, and that it worked well because our stepmother also worked. They asked if we would be okay with her picking us up some days, and we said yes. We talked about what we would call our stepmother, and we both wanted to use her name. She told us there was no pressure, but that if we ever wanted to call her Mom or something like that, she would love it. Dad assured us that we would still spend time with him. After they got married, Dad talked to us again and asked where we would want to be if something happened to him and he couldn't take care of us. We said at our grandparents' house. Dad told us he had already thought about it and that it had always been the plan, but that it was good to know it didn't have to change. We had a good relationship with our stepmother. It wasn't like on TV, where we eventually started seeing her as our new mom or second mom and calling her something affectionate. It wasn't that we told Dad we would stay with her if something happened to him, or that the birth of our step-siblings changed how we saw her or felt about her. But we also weren't one of those reality show families where we hated her and wanted nothing to do with her. There was no drama or anything like that. 2 years ago, Dad had a very serious accident and was in the hospital for 4 months and in rehabilitation for 3 more months. When that happened, we went to live with our grandparents. At that time, we weren't even sure if Dad would recover or survive, and we wanted to be with our grandparents. Our stepmother didn't say anything at the time, but we did have to call our step-siblings quite often and stop by the house to show them that we hadn't left forever. But it was hard because we felt more comfortable with our grandparents and needed them, but our step-siblings were begging us to come back. Dad recovered and came back home, and so did we. But after a few months of all of us being home, things got weird. One day, my father told us that my stepmother wanted the 4 of us to go to therapy together to talk about things. This took a while. It was super difficult to find a good therapist, and the waiting lists were crazy. But we started therapy in January. I'm not going to go into all the details, but my stepmother is hurt because we moved out when Dad had the accident and wants us to apologize for not staying. But my father, and she also said they expected us to stay in that situation. They didn't think that, after all this time, we would go live with our grandparents. She said we destroyed the family unit when we did that because our step-sibling suffered. She did too, and that it made everything worse. Dad said he simply assumed that if something happened, we would stay where we were, and that it was hard for him to see my stepmother so affected by the fact that we didn't. They said they expected that, over time, we would feel differently, and my stepmother said it was a wake-up call to realize that we didn't consider her our real mother, and that she had secretly hoped we did, and that it would grow over the years. She said an apology would be a good start to fixing things. I didn't apologize, and neither did Robin, but when the therapist asked me, I said that I thought my father and stepmother's expectations were unfair to Robin and me because it meant that everything we had talked about before had been useless. I said it put us in a bad position because they never asked us if we had changed our minds or if we would do things differently from what we had said before. The therapist asked my father and stepmother to address it and asked them some questions. My father said after therapy that he felt like I had tried to shame them for being honest, and that saying an apology wasn't much to ask, and that Robin and I refusing to do it meant we didn't care about the harm our decision had caused. But things didn't stop there. Robin and I talked a lot about what was happening, and the more we did, the more we realized that something didn't add up. We started to notice how the family dynamic had changed more than we thought. Our stepmother was now trying to impose herself more in our lives, as if she wanted to force us to see her as someone she wasn't. And then came the day we found the letter. A letter that my mother wrote before she died. A letter that they had never shown us. And that changed everything. The letter was hidden inside an old wooden box in our father's room. Robin found it by accident while looking for a document for school. The envelope, yellowed with time, had our names written in our mother's handwriting. We looked at each other in silence, not knowing what to do. My heart pounded as Robin opened it with trembling hands. Inside, the ink had faded slightly, but the words were still legible. We froze as we began to read. Our mother spoke with overwhelming sincerity. She told us how much she loved us, and how difficult it had been for her to know that she wouldn't get to see us grow up. But the most shocking part was that she mentioned something we had never suspected. She and Dad had talked about what would happen to us if she was gone. According to the letter, her greatest wish was that, if something happened to her, we would remain in the care of our grandparents. She wrote that she trusted Dad to respect that, and that, no matter what happened in his life, she knew he would always look out for our well-being. The air in the room felt heavy. If Mom had written this down, why had Dad never told us? Why did he let us believe that our decision had been selfish and painful for the family? How could he make us feel guilty when, in reality, we had done exactly what Mom wanted? That night, Robin and I couldn't sleep. We stayed up analyzing everything. We couldn't ignore it or pretend it hadn't happened. The next day, when Dad came home from work, we confronted him. We placed the letter on the table and waited for him to read it. His expression changed as he moved through the lines. His eyes shifted from surprise to discomfort and then to frustration. When he finished, he let out a heavy sigh and rubbed his face with both hands. "I didn't want you to see it," he said quietly. "Why?" Robin asked firmly. "Why did you hide this from us? You made us feel like we betrayed the family, but this proves we did the right thing." Dad took a long time to respond. Finally, he lifted his gaze and looked at us with regret. "Because I thought the best thing was for you to stay here, with me and the family we've built." His answer didn't satisfy us. He had manipulated the situation to make us feel bad for something that was never wrong. It was unfair. He had lied to us and made us doubt our own choices. "Does Stepmom know about this?" I asked cautiously. Dad looked away. His silence gave him away. "You showed it to her, but not to us," Robin said in disbelief. "She knew Mom wanted us to be with our grandparents, and yet she still blames us for doing it." Dad ran his hands through his hair, as if trying to find the right words. But there were no more excuses he could give. "I wanted things to work between you," he admitted. "I thought that over time, things would be different, and that you would see her as part of your family. I didn't want this to push you away from her." His justification didn't convince us. He had tried to force something that had never been our choice. He had ignored Mom's wishes, and in the process, ours as well. We got up from the table without saying another word. At that moment, we didn't have the energy to keep arguing. We went to our room and locked ourselves in. Robin was so furious she could barely sit still. "I can't believe it," she muttered. "I can't believe they made us feel guilty when we were right all along." I couldn't process it either. Everything had turned upside down. I felt like my perception of Dad had changed forever. But beyond that, I couldn't help but wonder what this meant for our relationship with our stepmother. The next day, we were called in for another therapy session. We hadn't spoken to Dad since the night before. The moment we sat down in the office, I knew something was wrong. Our stepmother was looking at us coldly, with an expression she had never directed at us before. "Dad told me about the letter," she said in a controlled voice. "Did you want me to feel like a stranger? To realize that you never considered me family?" Her words were harsh, but not harsher than reality. We couldn't lie to her. "It was never about hurting you," I said. "This is simply how we feel. And this letter proves that it wasn't irrational. It was what our mother wanted for us." The session turned tense. There were no raised voices, but the words exchanged carried more weight than any shouting could. Our stepmother felt betrayed, and though we tried to explain, she didn't seem to want to understand. To her, it was confirmation of her worst fears. To us, it was validation that we had done the right thing. When we left the session, Robin and I knew that things would never be the same again. There was a crack that could no longer be repaired. What we didn't know at that moment was that the letter hadn't just changed how we saw our family. It would also set in on a series of events that would make us question everything we thought we knew about our past. After the therapy session, the atmosphere at home became increasingly tense. Dad tried to talk to us several times, But neither Robin nor I had any intention of listening to him. He had failed us, hidden crucial information about our mother's wishes, and instead of understanding us, he had made us feel guilty for something that had actually been the right thing to do. Our stepmother also distanced herself. She no longer tried to get close as she used to, and when she did, her words were filled with resentment. She felt that we had completely rejected her, that we had made it clear she would never be part of our family. It didn't matter how much we tried to explain that it wasn't a decision against her, but rather in favor of our well-being and our mother's legacy. Her pain blinded her too much to see it. Weeks passed, and things kept deteriorating. At school, exams piled up, but I struggled to concentrate. Robin wasn't doing well either. She became quieter each day, and I knew that her way of processing what had happened was different from mine. While I tried to stay firm and not let everything affect me too much, she sank into her thoughts, going over everything that had happened again and again, trying to make sense of something that simply didn't. One afternoon, while we were doing homework in our room, Robin suddenly shut her notebook and looked at me with determination. "We can't keep going like this," she said firmly. "I don't want to spend the rest of the year feeling this way. We need answers." Answers, I asked, though deep down I already knew what she meant. Yes, about the letter, about why Dad decided to ignore Mom's wishes, about everything. We can't just accept what he told us that night at the table. It's not enough. I knew she was right. Something didn't quite add up, and the idea of accepting this incomplete version of the story was unbearable. So I agreed. We decided to search the house. We didn't want to do anything as drastic as snooping through Dad's things, but we also knew he wouldn't tell us the truth if we asked him directly. That night, when everyone was asleep, we snuck into his study. We knew it was risky, but we needed to know more. We searched through drawers, documents, anything that might give us a clue. Then, Robin found a file cabinet at the bottom of a closet. It was locked, but we found a key on the desk that fit perfectly. We opened it quickly and started looking through its contents. And there they were, the answers we didn't even know we were looking for. Legal documents, medical notes, and letters our mother had written in her last months of life. We were breathless as we realized what we had in our hands. One of the papers was a will, dated shortly before our mother passed away. In it, she made it clear that her wish was that, if something happened to her, we were to be raised by our grandparents. There was no room for doubt. It was something she had firmly wanted. So why hadn't that happened? How was it possible that this information had been ignored? Then, there was another document that sent chills down our spines. It was a legal agreement signed after Mom's death, in which our grandparents renounced their right to our custody and transferred it entirely to Dad. Robin and I looked at each other, confused. We knew our grandparents would never have made that decision on their own. Something had forced them. Something had made them accept an agreement that went against their own daughter's wishes. We kept searching through the files until we found several letters addressed to Dad. They were from our grandparents. We couldn't read them all at that moment, so we took a few and hid them in our room. When we were sure no one was around, we opened them. The first letter was from our grandmother. In it, she expressed her deep sorrow over not being able to raise us. She wrote that they had agreed to sign the document because Dad convinced them that the best thing for us was to stay with him, that our stability depended on it. She mentioned that they did it in the hope that, despite everything, Dad would honor Mom's memory and allow us to maintain a close relationship with them. But the most devastating part was in the next letter. It was from our grandfather, written a year later. In it, he reproached Dad for beginning to distance us from them, for the fact that we no longer spent as much time with them as before, and that this went against what they had agreed upon. He begged him to reconsider his decision, to think about what was best for us, not for him. The pain we felt reading that was indescribable. Not only had he hidden our mother's wishes, but he had also manipulated our grandparents into giving up. He lied to us about everything, Robin whispered. About Mom, about our grandparents, about what was best for us. We didn't know what to do with this information. Revealing it would change everything. But keeping it secret meant continuing to live in a lie. The next day, we woke up knowing we couldn't ignore it. The question was, what would we do now? The weight of the truth hit us, like an unstoppable wave. The words written in those letters had changed everything, dismantling the image we had of our father, and leaving us trapped in unbearable uncertainty. How had we lived so long without knowing the reality? Why had our grandparents never told us what had happened? That morning, Robin and I sat on the edge of the bed, the letters spread out over the blanket like evidence of a crime. We knew we couldn't keep pretending that nothing had happened. The question was how to confront it. "We can't do this alone," I said, breaking the silence. Robin nodded. Her eyes reflected the same confusion I felt. "We have to talk to the grandparents," she whispered. "They're the only ones who can explain what really happened." The idea scared us, but the alternative was worse. So, after school, instead of going home, we took the bus to our grandparents' house. The ride was silent. Neither of us knew what to expect. We were worried that, for some reason, they had chosen to keep the secret on purpose. What if they got angry at us for going through Dad's things? When we arrived, Grandma greeted us with a warm smile. But as soon as she saw our faces, her expression changed. She led us to the dining room, where Grandpa was already sitting with a cup of tea in his hands. He looked at us with that mix of wisdom and patience he had always had. "What's wrong, girls?" he asked. We looked at each other one last time before pulling out the letters and placing them on the table. Grandma recognized them instantly. Her hands trembled as she picked one up. Grandpa let out a deep sigh, as if the weight of the years had doubled in an instant. "Where did you find this?" His voice sounded tired, but not angry. "In Dad's study," I said, trying to stay calm. We needed answers. Grandpa ran a hand over his face, deep in thought. Grandma, on the other hand, looked like she was about to cry. Finally, he spoke. "We didn't want you to find out this way," he admitted. "But we also didn't want you to grow up resenting your father. We thought we were doing what was best for you." He explained that after Mom's death, there had been many arguments about who should take care of us. They wanted to follow through with what our mother had asked, but Dad insisted that we should stay with him. Over time, he convinced them that fighting for custody would do more harm than good. They didn't want us to be caught in a never-ending legal battle. We thought that if we accepted, at least we could still be part of your lives without conflict, Grandma said, her voice barely a whisper. But as the years passed, we started to notice how he was pulling you away from us. Grandpa nodded. By the time we realized it, it was too late. We were afraid that if we tried to do something, things would get even worse. Hearing that left us speechless. Not only had Dad ignored Mom's wishes, but he had manipulated our grandparents into giving up. We had lived our whole lives under a lie, believing that our decision to stay with them after the accident had been selfish, when, in reality, we had followed Mom's original wish. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Robin asked, her voice breaking. Grandma looked at us with sadness. "Because we loved you too much to risk losing you," she confessed. "And because we hoped that, in time, your father would change and do the right thing." We sat in silence. We didn't know what to do with all this information. We had found the truth. But now what? "Do you want to stay here tonight?" Grandpa asked. Robin and I exchanged a look. We hadn't brought clothes or our school things, but the idea of going back home and facing Dad was too much. "Yes," I replied, and Robin nodded. Grandma hugged us tightly, as if trying to give us all the love and security we had been missing for the past few years. That night, as we tried to sleep in our old room, I felt a knot in my chest slowly begin to unravel. The truth hurt, but at least we were no longer alone with it. The next morning, our phones were filled with messages and missed calls from Dad. He knew we hadn't come home and wanted answers. We looked at each other. We couldn't avoid him forever. When we returned, he was waiting for us in the living room, his face tense and his expression serious. He asked us to sit down. He didn't yell or scold us, but there was a severity in his eyes that we had never seen before. "I know you went to your grandparents' house," he said simply. Robin crossed her arms. "And what did you expect? For us to keep believing your lies?" Dad frowned. For a moment, he looked hurt, but he quickly composed himself. "They're not lies," he responded. "I only did what I thought was best for you." "No," I exclaimed. "You did what was best for you, for the family you wanted to build, without caring about what Mom wanted or what we needed." The room fell into a tense silence. Dad clenched his fists on his knees, but didn't respond right away. He seemed to be debating with himself. Finally, he sighed and looked at us with an expression more exhausted than angry. "I can't change what I did," he admitted, "and I can't force you to forgive me. But what I can do is try to fix things." We weren't sure what that meant. We didn't know if we could trust him after everything. But what we did know was that, after what we had discovered, we couldn't go back. The only way was forward, even if the path was still full of uncertainty. Dad's words hung in the air, heavy and difficult to digest. Trying to fix things. How was he supposed to do that after years of lies and manipulation? Robin and I looked at each other, searching for answers in the other, but we didn't have them. We didn't know if we could trust him again. The silence stretched until Robin decided to break it. "You can't fix what you did just by saying it," she said firmly. "You made us doubt ourselves, our feelings, what Mom wanted. It's not as simple as apologizing." Dad closed his eyes and nodded slowly. "I know," he murmured, "and I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want to try." His words sounded sincere, but trust isn't regained with empty promises. There were too many wounds, too many things that couldn't be undone. We stood up without saying anything else and went up to our room. We didn't want to continue that conversation. We needed space. That night, Robin and I talked until dawn. It wasn't just about Dad's betrayal, but about what would come next. Could we keep living in that house? Could we bear to see him every day after knowing what he had done? What did we want for ourselves now? The answer became clear. The next morning, when we went downstairs, we found Dad sitting on the couch, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor. He looked like he had been there all night, waiting for us to say something. We looked at him and took a deep breath before speaking. "We're moving in with our grandparents," I said bluntly. Dad lifted his head suddenly. His eyes reflected a mix of surprise and sadness, but he didn't argue. "I understand," he replied after a moment. "I don't want to lose you, but I know I can't force you to stay here." It was the first time he acknowledged that he had no control over us. Maybe, at another time, he would have tried to convince us otherwise. But we weren't little girls anymore. We knew what we wanted, and we weren't going to let him decide for us again. It took us a week to pack our things. Our stepmother avoided any conversation with us. She didn't try to stop us or show any emotion, which made it clear that, in her mind, we were the villains of the story. Our step-siblings didn't fully understand what was happening, but they seemed distant. We couldn't blame them. From their perspective, we might have seemed selfish, but we knew the truth, and that was all that mattered. When we finally closed the door to that house, we felt a mix of relief and sadness. It was the end of a chapter, of a story we had believed we knew, but was full of secrets. We were leaving behind a life built on lies and heading towards something new, something more real. The first few days at our grandparents' house felt strange. Even though we had always spent time with them, this was different. This time, it was permanent. But as the days passed, we started to feel more at peace. For the first time in a long time, there was no invisible pressure on us, no imposed expectations. We could breathe. Dad tried to call us several times, but we didn't always answer. Not because we wanted to punish him, but because we weren't ready to talk to him yet. We needed time, and he seemed to understand that. As the months passed, things started to settle. The anger faded. The pain turned into a lesson, and life went on. We still saw Dad, but on our terms. Little by little, he tried to show that he truly wanted to change. It wasn't easy, but over time, we learned to rebuild our relationship from a different place, one without impositions or lies. Robin and I never forgot what happened, but we didn't let it define us either. We didn't become people full of resentment. Instead, we learned to set boundaries, to choose what was best for us, and to never let anyone make us doubt our own decisions. And so, without a perfect ending or unrealistic promises, our story took a new turn. Not one from a fairy tale, but a real one. One where we were finally in control of our own destiny.